All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our May Extension Master Gardener webinar. I'm so happy to see so many of you who are able to join us for this live session. As I just noted, this session is recorded and will be posted to our webinar archive early next week. Any resources from today will also be posted there. Laurie has already shared a copy of the presentation and other things that we will make sure everyone has access to. I will share that archive link in the chat box in just a moment. And throughout the session, please use the chat box, like I see everybody doing now, to ask any questions for our speaker. We'll let her get through her presentation, and then we'll get to as many of those questions as we can after the end of the program. So with all that taken care of, I would now like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Laurie Fox. She is a research associate at the Hampton Roads Agricultural Research and Extension Center, or AREC, as you might often hear. She is a strong supporter of the EMG program locally and statewide, and we welcome her back to our webinar series. Thanks for joining us, Laurie. Take it away.
All right, thank you all very much. It's a pleasure to be here. This is a very sort of timely and interesting topic for any number of reasons. But this particular presentation, I had the pleasure of working with Ed Olsen, who is the horticulture agent in Henrico. And we put this together actually as part of a training for extension agents. But it actually, you guys are the ones that probably get the questions frequently on invasive plant management. So as Kathleen said, it's being recorded, and there is a handout that lists all of the resources that I'm going to cover in the presentation. So this is meant to be a resource for you. And if you want the actual presentation, you can contact Kathleen or me. I have no problems with you taking this presentation and modifying it and using it for your own. So what we're going to do today is go through what exactly constitutes an invasive plant, look at what management options are out there, and then dive into a lot of the different resources, who's who, who's doing what, and where you can find more information about things. So invasive species, it's a very broad umbrella term, and it encompasses plants, animals, insects, and diseases. However, for the purposes of this presentation today, we're focusing only on invasive plant species. Basically, the two criteria that have to be met are that it is non-native to the ecosystem, meaning that the plant did not co-evolve with other plant species and other animal and insect species in that geographic area. So it is from outside of that geographic area. And also that this particular plant, the introduction of it into the ecosystem has resulted in significant economic or environmental harm, or it poses harm or risk to human health. So those are the key criteria for what constitutes an invasive species. What? That's the end of the presentation. It's not supposed to be there. Okay. So the characteristics that define an invasive plant kind of parallel with what the characteristics are for any plant that we consider to be a weed. Generally, the plant has a rapid growth habit and reaches maturity very quickly, which allows it then to set its seed quicker than other plants might. And then also when it does set seed, it's very prolific in setting the high numbers of seed. And then those seed are highly successful at being dispersed and at germinating and then at colonizing an area very quickly. So all of those things give it sort of a jump on other plants. Not only do they spread by seed, but most of these plants have vegetative options for spreading as well. And the bottom line is whatever they're doing it better and quicker, and it gives them the ability to outcompete surrounding native species. And once they are started, once they're established, then it's very costly to remove them. And then people say weed control, but I prefer the term management because it's going to be a continuous ongoing battle. It's kind of a little bit naive to think that you're going to actually get control of them. That's a very tough situation. All right, so the situation currently in Virginia, There are approximately 90 plants on the Virginia invasive plant species list. And if you just Google Virginia invasive species, that will come up, but the link to this is also on the resource handout. And they have them grouped by highly, moderately, and low invasive sort of status. And then, of course, from a monetary standpoint, and you can see that this is 2005 information. We couldn't find any more recent, but it's definitely at $100 billion plus. That's billion with a B, for the damage and the costs to the economy for the state for dealing with these invasive species. Unfortunately, the finger points at all of us. We are the ones that are the primary means of introducing these plants and spreading them around. And it happens frequently through how we travel, or we find something somewhere that we've traveled to, and we take a cutting of it, or we purchase a plant and then we bring it back home with us. All of our transportation systems, a lot of times these seeds and things hitchhike. We are great disturbers of the land, and anytime you disturb the land, then what you are doing is creating an environment that may not necessarily have the specific conditions that the native plants need in order to grow and thrive, and that provides an opportunity for then these invasive species, which are very opportunistic and will come in to a disturbed area very, very quickly. We also spread them through our recreational activities, and in some cases just our plain ignorance of not being aware of what is invasive and going ahead and putting it in our landscapes anyway. So we're sort of the cause of the problem, and of course we can certainly be the solution to the problem as well. So again, sort of broadly, these species of plants cause environmental problems, economic problems, aesthetic problems, and cultural problems. And they do that by displacing or outcompeting our native species of plants. What this does then is skew and reduce the habitat for our wildlife, and it creates habitats that don't support our wildlife populations, because they're not the right shelter, that's not the right food, or actually some critters are poisoned by some of these species of plants as they eat them or whatever. It also alters the natural ecosystem processes. So ecosystems evolve over time. They go through seasonal and longer term changes and growth. And when you introduce something that comes in and interrupts that whole process, I mean, it's like the ripple effect. It has many consequences. The land that we use for growing our food crops, our agriculture crops, and our rangeland areas, when these invasive species come into those ecosystems, they degrade them, make them less productive, make it more costly to produce these products. There are aquatic invasive species as well. They tend to clog our waterways. They mess up navigation on our waterways, mess up our fishing and boating and swimming recreational activities. And again, they skew the aquatic environment just as well as they do the plants that are on the land. They also interfere with things like our power grids and right-of-ways. And again, are very costly to maintain those areas and keep the invasives out. They invade our own personal landscapes and cause problems. And then from a health perspective, there's quite a few of them that cause allergic reactions when we come into contact with them. So they're very sort of unsavory in that regard. Right, these are just a few of the most common ones that we see across the state. Everybody knows about English ivy. It was heavily used and still is as a ground cover for shade areas, but it's very aggressive, spreads vegetatively as well as by seeds. When it climbs trees, it does have mature adult foliage, and then it does flower and seed, and the birds are very handy at spreading the seeds around. And it's all of these are on the list, and they're all tough to manage. So Phragmites, you tend to find more in coastal Virginia. This is one that's brackish water tolerant. It is a giant reed. This is Phragmites australis. And we do have our own native Phragmites in Virginia, but it is not nearly as aggressive. This one is aggressive to the point that they do controlled burns, and they will spray in a lot of the refuges with helicopters or planes, because it just is so prolific and just really grows so densely that nothing else has a chance. Japanese stiltgrass, this is one that we are finding more and more in our park systems or natural areas. And it's called stiltgrass because the stem grows up, and then as it falls over, each place there's a node, or where a leaf comes out on the stem, it can shoot down a root to touch the ground. So it's like walking on stilts over top of other plants. And this is really, really bad in our natural areas, in our local and state and federal parks. It's not only herbaceous plants, we do have a wide variety of woody plants that are also considered invasive. The Chinese privet, you can go into any garden center or nursery today and find Chinese privet for sale. A lot of times it's dwarf varieties or variegated leaves or something like that. But the bottom line is it's still a Chinese privet. And just because it is a cultivar that has some unique characteristic does not mean that it is not still a very aggressive and invasive plant. Autumn olive, this is one, if some of you will remember, was used really heavily in highway medians. It's a very large evergreen shrub, very prolific with the berries, and then they're very attracted to the cedar waxwings, and the birds were flying into the medians to eat the berries, and then they were getting hit by cars, and there was a high mortality rate of the birds. And so for that reason, a lot of the autumn olive was removed from the medians, but also just the fact that it has reseeds prolifically into natural areas that makes it aggressive. And again, a very fast grower and very dense as far as the thickets that it will form. And then, of course, most everybody knows about the tree of heaven being a very aggressive invasive tree species. Just a few more here. The Japanese honeysuckle. There are native honeysuckles, but it is not this one. And this is just sort of ubiquitous everywhere now. And then kudzu was one that was actually brought in for erosion control, and just kind of got out of control. It controls erosion very, very well, but it does a lot of other things that are very undesirable, such as creating these kudzu forests. And then, of course, the big one now, the calorie pears, Bradford pears. They are not sterile. They do hybridize. They do seed prolifically into our natural areas. This was one that was supposed to be a really fabulous landscape plant. And looking back on it, probably not the best idea to proliferate it as quickly as we did without doing a little bit of long-term research on its behavior. This is the one, calorie pears. Right now, you might get questions from your locality. There are a lot of programs now for localities to remove the pears that they had put in on public property and as city street trees. And I've been asked the question quite a few times, want to remove it, what should we replace it with? So that might be a good opportunity for master gardeners to have an impact locally. All right, so management of these invasive species. You can do prevention, you can physically and mechanically remove them, and you can use chemicals. Whichever method you select, keep in mind that it's going to require a fair amount of time. It's going to be labor intensive, and you're going to have to be persistent and have a commitment, because it's not a one and done kind of thing. It's a multi-year process for most situations. So for prevention, Don't buy it in the first place. Do your research on a new plant that you may not be familiar with. See, what's going on, who says what about it. And even if it's a relative of one of the invasives, don't assume that because it's not on that invasive list, it doesn't have the same aggressive characteristics that the relative that is on the invasive list does have. Keep our recreational vehicles clean, our trailers and our boat propellers and things. If you go fishing in a pond and it's infested with, I don't know, alligator weed or something else, clean your boats and your trailers before you then move that equipment to another pond, and don't you be the one that spreads it. Keeping your tools and machinery clean. And this could be as simple as, you dig in one part of your yard, and I've done this myself, maybe it's got nutsedge or something like that. Clean your shovel before you go dig in a different part of the yard, so you're not spreading the problem that way with your tools. Or with some of these landscape companies, that have mowing equipment, and they go mow a site that is infested with a specific weed, and then it sticks to the undersides of the mowers and things, and then they come and mow your property, and they're spreading it that way. Maybe doing, I just got an email that came across about pruning Phragmites in one of our parks. So what they're doing there is pruning off the flower heads so that it prevents the plant from creating seeds. And so you may not be able to get rid of the individual plant, but if you can prevent it from seeding, that will help prevent future plants. Limit the soil disturbance. Anytime you disturb soil, you turn it up, you bring up weed seeds, or you provide, again, a disturbed site that's like an invitation for some of these invasive plants to come in and colonize. So a lot of times if you're working in a landscape, it's not about going in and removing a lot of things in an area. Maybe it's more about going in and strategically removing very specific things with as little disturbance as possible. So it's more of a focused strategic removal of something versus cutting everything down or digging everything up. And then if you are incorporating new plants into a disturbed site or just into your landscape, use native species, plant them densely so that they can fill in quickly, and offer competition so that it's not so easy for the invasive species to come into the landscape. The other thing is with prevention, scouting to catch things really, really early. Don't let that one little plant that you notice go until it sets seed or multiplies, and then the next season you've got a million of them. So scouting, catching things early, dealing with it when it's very small in size and hasn't had an opportunity to proliferate in the landscape. Physical and mechanical removal. Of course, the 10-finger hand pulling method never goes out of style. And you can always pull things out. You can certainly dig things out, raking things out. A lot of these removal mechanisms depend on what the invasive species growth habit is, as to which one is going to be most effective. And sometimes you actually use a combination of things. Cutting or girdling it, if it's a woody plant, using cardboard and mulch or black plastic to smother and sort of solarize areas to prevent weed seeds from germinating or to kill off vegetative species. You can, in some cases, do controlled burns. They do that with Phragmites, again, in some of these wildlife refuges and things. I don't think it's anything that anybody's going to recommend that you do on a residential property, although there are weed torches that are out there that can be used. But most of these that are invasive tend to be perennial, and burning, just makes it mad and it grows back. You can also graze. I've been to several conferences and things where I've seen presentations where like the Department of Transportation or some of your agricultural producers or your parkland people actually use goats to graze and manage some of these invasive species that way. You just keep eating them down, and eventually they give up and die. You exhaust their storage resources. From a chemical standpoint, you are using herbicides because you are killing a plant, and you've got two options there. You can put a pre-emergent down. So this is an herbicide that you put down before the weed seed germinates, and it dissolves, and the little particles sort of flow together and create this like blanket on the soil surface so that the weed seeds cannot germinate. And that's how you can prevent a lot of if something has set seed and you know it's there, that maybe if you do one pre-emergent treatment cycle, that'll prevent a lot of those seed from germinating and really knock the population back. If it's too late, if it's already up and growing, you can use a post-emergent application, meaning you are treating it post-germination and it's actively growing. And you can do that in a number of different ways, depending on where you are, how many of these invasive species, what the population is, whether or not it's surrounded by desirable plants or if it's a monoculture stand of them, and what time of the year. You can apply the post-emergent herbicide in different ways. So you can do a spot treatment, which is again a very small focused type of a treatment where you're going in and very strategically removing or treating the invasive species. You can do a dip and clip. This is really good for your woodies, especially in the fall when the plants are translocating downward to go dormant. You get a lot more of the herbicide translocated down into the root system, which gives you a higher kill. With a dip and clip, you're dipping clippers or loppers in an herbicide and then cutting off the stems. And this is a method that actually, if you're in a sensitive area and spraying really isn't an option because you can't take a chance that you've got drift that could damage desirable plants that are nearby, a dip and clip method might work. Just remember to clean your pruners or your loppers thoroughly before you go ahead and use them on a desirable plant. Hack and squirt is just another method of dip and clip. It's a little less refined. Usually you're using a matchet, or something like that. And then you've got a backpack on, and so with one hand, just like you're cutting the vegetation down, and with the other hand, you're spraying it, and you're not being real, conscientious about how you're pruning it or anything like that. That's when you need to get through a big stand of something in a hurry. And then there's the wick and wipe, or wick or wipe, I should say. And that's basically where you are wiping or smearing the herbicide onto the plant. This is used a lot with things like that, the Phragmites, because it has very upright growth habit and a waxy coat on the leaf. So if you try and spray it, it will beat up and roll off, and the plant really won't absorb the herbicide. So with a wick or a wiper application, you can put a cotton glove over top of an herbicide resistant glove, dip your hand in the herbicide, and then smear or wipe it on the plant. Or there are specific like wands where you put the herbicide in the handle, and it is wicked out onto a cotton rope that you then swing and wipe back and forth across the invasive species foliage. Again, regardless of which method you're using, or combination in most cases of methods that you are using, keep in mind that it's going to be a long-term commitment and fairly labor intensive. All right. There we go. So Virginia does have an invasive species management plan, and it's not that old. There was a Virginia Invasive Species Advisory Committee that was put together, and a Virginia Invasive Species Working Group. They put this plan together. The first part of it really involves understanding who's involved. So, and what the flow chart is for identifying a problem, and then reporting it, and what the protocol is, and identifying, is it something that's already existing, or is this something new coming into the state? And then going down through this chart to find out who's responsible, which agency. And so this plan covers plants, insects, animals, and diseases. So it's a rather broad plan. And then some of the different agencies that are involved that might be responsible for certain situations would be the Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. It used to be the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, but it is now the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources. The Virginia Department of Marine Resources, or excuse me, the Virginia Marine Resources Commission, the Virginia Department of Transportation. So those are some of the agencies that would deal with some of these invasive species on a broader scale. Okay, so the Invasive Plant Species of Virginia Working Group, this is a different group than the ones that did the report I just showed you. This is a more recent group that was created because of a joint resolution through the Virginia Assembly, and they involved the two agencies, the Department of Conservation and Recreation and the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. And they were tasked with studying the sale and use of invasive plant species in our landscapes, because there's been a lot of controversy and discussion about nurseries producing and selling, and also garden centers selling plants that we consider invasive species here in Virginia. And so they wanted to gather information, look at what this scenario looked like, and then they were tasked with reporting back to the Virginia General Assembly, creating the report on what they found, and including recommendations on what should be done. And to the best of my knowledge, I don't think the last I heard or saw anything on this report, it didn't seem that they had a long list of specific action items, and the ones that they did have listed, I'm not sure what the next steps were going to be relative to whether or not anything would be implemented. So basically, this group was put together to gather information and create this report and report back to the General Assembly, and then pretty much their job is done. There is a Virginia Tech Invasive Species Working Group. So this one's been around for a little while, and they are very active. This group works through Virginia Tech's Global Change Center. And again, they look at all species, not just plants. And what they try and do is work within the science to impact policy and management recommendations, and do it in a way that kind of meets the social needs and demands for managing these species. So they've been very active, and then they just had a planning group meeting, I think back in February, where they discussed that they were going to put in a proposal for additional funding to continue the work that they have been doing. And so what they would be looking at are things like new faculty hires to do new research, or to teach new courses, or to work on resources for extension. They would look for additional funding streams to help create management programs and sort of activities across the state. And then they would look at somehow setting up a networking system so that people are talking to people across agencies, across disciplines, and they're networking and coordinating because there's a lot of going on. Everybody's kind of going towards the same goal, but we may not necessarily know about or be aware of what else is going on outside of our own little area. So they do have newsletters. The link to this group is on the resource handout if you want to kind of keep up with what they are doing. So now's the time we're going to kind of go ahead and roll it on into the resources section because, I can talk all day about invasives, but that doesn't do you any good. You get the questions, you need to know what resources are available to help you get information and form a response or a recommendation in a timely manner. So we'll start with extension resources. If you ever go to the extension publication website and just type in invasive species or invasive plants or something like that, it's always interesting to see what pops up. And we do have a pub that's sort of a general pub on invasive plants. And then we have some things that are more specific. So we have pubs on some of the very top invasive species in the state, like the ailanthus tree. And then with the ailanthus, there's a really good additional pub that compares this one with other things that look like it. So how do you tell them apart as to whether or not this is really the ailanthus that you've got versus something like sumac or a walnut tree or something like that. So these are really good extension resources that are already here available to you in-house. Some things that are sort of outside of cooperative extension, but are also really good resources to kind of have on a list or in your back pocket. There is an invasive species Virginia website. And again, it covers all different species, not just plants, but it's a very good sort of website to go to for a variety of information. And then there is the, in the middle, the very newly updated and printed, this just happened late last fall, Plant Invaders of Mid-Atlantic Natural Areas, the field guide. So that is now back in print and updated. And then the Department of Conservation and Recreation, which is the organization that has the invasive species list for the state of Virginia. They also have a series of publications on the different individual species. So you see here, the example is the autumn or Russian olive. And talking about the plant, how you recognize it, that sort of thing. There's also this book. Again, it's an identification guide specifically for the Mid-Atlantic. But this again talks about the invasive species and other things that look similar. So how do you tell things apart? Again, to make sure that you know that it is indeed an invasive species that you're dealing with, and you're not running around killing something that looks very similar to it, but is a good thing to have. So, so that's a really good book. Some of the like this is from your Soil and Water Conservation District. Some of these other agencies have publications. Some of your grassroots organizations have publications. But the point of these is, plant these plants, not these other plants that, again, might be available for sale, but really are not suitable to put into the landscape because they have strong potential or they've already been proven to be invasive. So plant this, not that. What are your alternatives? Other resources, Department of Conservation and Recreation has this guide. It's mainly geared towards like parkland areas, small wooded areas, things like that. But the information in it is still very valuable about how you identify things and how you approach developing your management strategy. And then this is the EDD maps, and that stands for early detection and distribution. And so again, this goes back to scouting and monitoring and trying to catch problems when they first start, so that they don't get so out of control, and so it doesn't take so much time and effort and money to try and manage them. So this is sort of like citizen science, if you will. But it's a an app, and it's a way to, again, correctly identify plants and report if you have found something, especially something that's new to the state or something that is in a part of the state that it hasn't been in previously. And it's how they track the spread of things. So this EDD app, it's a way that you can report sightings. And again, it's not just plant focused, it's the insects, the diseases, and the animals or wildlife. And they have a lot of good information on here about these different categories. But the first thing is to report what you're seeing. Then that goes into the system, and a distribution map is created, and it looks something like this. So this would be the distribution map for the Phragmites. You see, again, it's heavily coastal, a little bit lighter in the Piedmont, but you are picking it up more heavily in the western part of the state now. And so this helps you to understand where it's more prolific, where you're more likely to have a problem with it, you know, in the state, which is good. And just because some of these counties are not green doesn't mean that Phragmites is not there. It just may mean it hasn't been reported as being in that location yet. And then on these species, again, they do have really good information about them. And the other thing that they do is kind of zoom out and show you on a national level the distribution of some of these invasive species. So if you look, you'll see that, yeah, it shows you that it is on a the paler colored orange is on a state list only, and then the darker red shows you that it's actually part of state law, that plant has regulations about managing it within that state. And so it kind of gives you a broader national perspective on the distribution of the plant. So on these resource pages, you'll see that there's like places where you can learn information, places where you can get information that helps you actually do something. And then we'll wrap up with other places that you can, like Who's Who, other organizations that you can maybe ask for assistance. So in Virginia, we do have 2 PRISM groups, and this stands for Partnerships for Regional Invasive Species Management. So the most active one is Blue Ridge, which is in the Shenandoah Valley, but there is one that is also in Northern Virginia. And these are organizations focused on and dedicated to managing invasive species within that geographic area that they're located. So these folks also have resources, again, that you can learn about things. This is like an example here. This is the lesser celandine. We actually just had to treat for this in some of our demonstration gardens here at the research center. So where you can learn about the different invasive species and become familiar with them. And then the PRISMs also have information on management or control options. So similar to the slide I showed with your prevention, your physical and mechanical, and your herbicide, but they go into things a little bit more in detail about understanding the plant's life cycle and where you might be able to interrupt it or intercede using some of these strategies in order to try and control the invasion. We do have recommendations as well through our pest management guides. You kind of have to hunt for it. There aren't really defined sections devoted to invasive species, and it depends on what you're dealing with and where it is as to which management guide the information is in. A lot of it is in the horticulture and forest crops guide under the non-cropland areas, and but there are recommendations in our guides, specific recommendations for chemical management with herbicides. The Virginia Department of Forestry also has chemical recommendations. They're dealing a lot with invasives in like timber land production areas or park areas or national forests, things like that. And so they have some very specific recommendations here as well. So obviously, if you have questions and you're making recommendations, you start with Virginia Tech's resources first. But in the case that we don't have something for you, then what you would do is go to one of these other agencies and look at what their resources have and recommend. Right, so help with some of this. It would be some of your plant identification apps, because when you're out there, pretty much everybody has a cell phone these days. A lot of these apps are free, or there's a minimal like yearly subscription fee, but you have the app, and then you can take the picture, upload it to the app, and it will help you with identification. Because again, you really shouldn't and can't make any decisions about what to do about something unless you're positively identified it as a problem. And if you're not into the apps, then this field guide for the ID of invasive plants is also very helpful. You can also, it's not on here and it's not an app, but you can upload pictures in Google Images and have it search and see if something comes up in that regard as well. To make sure again that the plant that you're looking at is an invasive plant. And once you've identified it positively, then you can move on to what do I do about it. Again, these other organizations, the Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, again, that's where the master list of invasive species in Virginia is. That's where a lot of those flyers on specific invasive species are. Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, they tend to play a regulatory role because they have your plant inspectors that go out and inspect your nurseries and your garden centers, and they try and help, do early detection and, prevent the spread of invasive species. And then, of course, the educational component, that's where you guys come in through Virginia Cooperative Extension, helping get people information so that they can make smart decisions about what to do. So in the future, relative to extension and invasive species, there probably will be some additional extension publications forthcoming on this. There's the possibility for hands-on trainings or workshops, and you can either do that through like Master Gardener webinars or Master Gardener College, or you can hook up with one of those organizations in your locality. They often have volunteer opportunities where you can go out and learn to identify the invasives and then actually get some hands-on experience managing them. Probably there will be additional information that will eventually get put into the pest management guides so that we have more recommendations, more options for what to do and how to do it from a chemical standpoint. More PowerPoint presentations, that's just what we all need, right? But something like what we're doing today that's recorded, you may not have a question for months, or it may even be next year. but eventually a question will come. And then what this does is provide this resource that you can go back to, or maybe you're asked to talk about the topic. So you have those resources available. And there would be ones like this that's kind of a generic overview of invasives, but then there could also be some presentations that would be way more specific. How do you manage aquatic invasive plants or things like that? And a lot of times those specific ones revolve around your pesticide recertification courses. So it might be, invasives that are in right-of-ways or ponds or under utility easements, things like that, where your applicators have to be certified and trained for those specific areas. And then part of what's going on through the Virginia Tech Invasive Species Working Group and through some of these PRISM local groups, looking at statewide action plans. How do we not only address this, in our little section of the state, but is it a problem statewide? And how can we exchange information, exchange success stories, and maybe try and get a handle on it from a statewide perspective? So those things are probably going to be forthcoming as well. So stay tuned for all of this, or if you have ideas or want to participate in developing any of these resources and things, get in touch with me or somebody on the Invasive Species Plant Working Group at Virginia Tech. All right, so that kind of wraps up the presentation. And this is how you find me. Email is the very best way to catch me because I'm in and out of the office so very much. And I am based down at the Hampton Roads Research Center in Virginia Beach. But I am always available to help with anything. And again, if you want a PowerPoint copy of this presentation to utilize for things that you're doing in your community, you are more than welcome to it. So with that, I think what I'll do is stop sharing at this point, and we will go ahead and look into the chat box. And Kathleen, were you going to go through and read questions, or do you want me to just scroll?
Yes, I've been collecting a list as questions have been coming through, so we can just go through that.
All right,
But before we do that, thank you, Laurie, for that great presentation and all of those resources. Again, that resource list and a recording of the presentation will be posted to the webinar archive. And as a little plug, if you are interested in invasive species, both plant and insect, think about coming to Master Gardener College in June, because we do have some sessions focused on those topics, and we would love to see you. So with that, I will go ahead and start asking questions. So the first one, could you describe the difference between invasive, exotic, and naturalized?
Okay. So a lot of times exotic is used in combination, exotic, invasive. Exotic just is a term that refers to something that is non-native. And you can have exotic plants that are invasive, and you can have exotic plants that are not invasive. So exotic just means it's not something that is native and is co-evolved to that geographic region. Invasive means that it meets those criterias of being aggressive and causing harm economically or to crops or to human health, and to the point where that the problems are interfering significantly. And then the last one was exotic, invasive, and what?
Naturalized.
Naturalized. Naturalized is just another general term, and it can refer to invasive as well as non-invasive plants. It just means that the plant has spread over a wide area and is thriving over a wide area. So, native plants can naturalize just as well as non-natives. And just because something has naturalized does not necessarily mean it's invasive. So you have to be careful how you combine those terms. And there's a lot of different terminology out there.
Yeah, and I think it's good to make sure to understand all those definitions. I think that was a great question, because the more that we understand the words that are being used, the easier it is to share that with people.
Well, and
make
then
sure
there's
that
different definitions depending on where you're looking at your information. Different organizations refer to things, a little bit differently.
All right, the next question is, do state parks have programs to address invasive species?
Yes, they do. So that's through the Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, because they are the ones that deal with parklands. But Department of Forestry, probably that's where that resource came from, because they don't do parkland so much as they do, forest land management. But those are still a lot of times public access areas. So yes, both of those organizations have plans. What they don't have is a lot of funding and a lot of bodies, people, to be out there. You have to be out there, you have to be treating things in a timely manner. And so that's kind of where things get hampered and slowed down as far as successful management of these invasives.
Sure. And that kind of relates to another question about, is there anywhere people could go for help with funding to help eradicate some of these in their spaces, whether that's public or private?
Yes. I would check out if you live in one of the areas of Shenandoah Valley or Northern Virginia where the prisms are. I would look at whether or not your locality has any kind of maybe cost share programs for invasive species management. Some do. And then you might also see if the Department of Wildlife Resources has anything. There's just not one agency or one program that just has money laying around that they'll give you to help offset the cost. Some of them may have cost share programs. Some of them may be small grant programs that you may need to check into. Maybe it's not anything to do with cost. Maybe it's just getting on a list in your municipality where they do volunteer work days and come out and do work on removing invasive species. I know here in Virginia Beach that happens like on some of the maybe historic properties. They'll have a volunteer work day where, again, you go out, you identify, this is what we're dealing with, this is how we're managing it, and then 50 people go out and attack and kind of clear an area out of the invasive species. So there's different ways, and it's not always all about the money, but yes, there are ways to support removing the invasives.
Great, thanks for that. We've had a few questions about specific plants.
Always.
Yeah. Any suggestions for getting rid of vinca?
All right. So when you say vinca, again, you have to be sure you know what plant you're talking about, because there is an annual ornamental vinca plant. And most people don't consider that invasive, but it has been known to reseed into areas that you don't want it. If you're talking invasives, generally you're talking about either vinca minor or vinca major, which is an evergreen ground cover vine. Sometimes it's green leaf, sometimes it's variegated, and it has a little lavender flower. That one, it's pretty much a chemical control, and you have to use an herbicide for a number of reasons. Because of the way it spreads, every time it sends out a little runner, it roots where it touches the ground. And if you're trying to mechanically remove it and you pull it out, that thin little stem breaks off and you leave a little rooted piece in the ground, and it really is not an effective way to try and manage it. You can put goats on it, of course, if you want to do something like that. But most often what you need to do is spray it with an herbicide, and you need a post-emergent herbicide, and you need one that is translocated versus a contact herbicide. So contact herbicide only kills the plant tissue that it comes into contact with. A translocated herbicide is one that you get it on the plant and the plant absorbs it and moves the herbicide throughout the entire plant system, all the way up into the leaves and through the stems and down into the roots. And so because this is a perennial weed, that's the best option. However, there's a couple of things to think about. It has a waxy coat on the leaf, which makes it difficult for the herbicide to be absorbed. So you might add some type of a spread or sticker in with it. And that way it spreads the droplet of water out. It releases that tension, spreads it out on the leaf, gives it more of a chance to soak in. You should make your applications in the early spring when the new growth is coming out, before it develops that thick waxy coat. Or you can mow the plant, and then all of the new growth that comes out is young and tender, and spray it at that point. Or you can mow in the late summer, and then as it regrows in the fall, it starts to translocate down to go dormant for the winter. And you can use an herbicide at that point in time, which ups the percent of kill, because when the translocation is going down, it's moving the herbicide more heavily into the roots of the plant. And so you'll get a lot less of it growing back in the spring. So that's part of understanding the plant's life cycle, and where in that life cycle you can interrupt it, and how changing different application methods might be more effective on some plants versus others. It's probably going to be about a 2-year process.
Next question is about bamboo and whether it's invasive, and if so, if you have bamboo, how do you kill it?
Yes, bamboo is highly invasive. I don't care what kind it is. I don't care if they tell you it's a clumper or not. I have never met a bamboo that isn't aggressive. So again, that's one that you can mow it or cut it down, but it has a lot of storage in those underground rhizomes, and it is just going to keep growing back. And theoretically, you could keep mowing and mowing and mowing, and eventually those storage reserves will get exhausted. But I don't know anybody that sticks to it long enough for that to happen. I think most people give up in frustration and eventually resort to herbicides. So we just actually did this here at the research center, had a huge stand that was getting out of control. We mowed it down. All of the new growth was sprayed with a translocated herbicide, meaning it's going into the plant. That may kill the top growth, but you're going to get resprouts, and you're going to need to make multiple applications over the course of the year. And you've got to do it when the growth is young and tender, again, before it gets that heavy waxy coat on the stem and on the leaves. So that's a real booger to deal with, unfortunately. If it's a very small stand, you could do a dip and clip if you wanted to. But often by the time people get around to controlling it, it's a fairly large stand.
Thanks. Let's see. Okay, so there's someone who's saying that they have multiple invasive species over about 22 acres. Realistically, will you ever be able to gain control over the invasive spread?
Yes. So again, you have to set realistic goals. You have to positively ID what you've got and look at the weak points and the best management options for each individual species. But then you have to put things together in a reasonable type of a management plan. And you have to start small. So start in one corner, or start with clearing around some native plants so that you can keep that clear and let the natives fill in, and then you can move on to a different area. There's no way with that much acreage you're going to get it done, in a couple of treatments. You may need to do something in combination, like hire goats or rent a brush. What are those pieces of equipment that go in and mow brush down? And then, maybe treat what the regrowth is. So you kind of have to look at what all your options are, what you're capable of, whether or not you've got a budget for anything, because herbicides can be expensive, renting equipment can be expensive. Also, if it's something like poison ivy that you're allergic to, do you even want to bother with it, or do you want to hire it out to the goats or something like that? So there's a lot of different factors, but yes, you can. It's just going to be a long process.
All right, and then
the areas that you treat, you have to make sure to go back and keep them cleared.
Right. We'll get just one final question that came through that I don't think we've addressed is there's a couple weeds mentioned. Greenbrier and Virginia creeper are entering their yard from the neighbor's yard, growing into their bushes and trees. What's the best way to get rid of them when they are spreading from another source that is not your property?
Okay, so Virginia creeper is very easy. It's not it is a native plant, and it is good and beneficial to birds and wildlife. And it's very easy to pull up. It doesn't root in. It usually goes back to one point, and you can pull it out very easily, and it comes off of trees and out of shrubs very easily. So, you know, your 10-fingered hand pulling method is fine with that. The trick to that too is to prevent it from seeding if you can. So don't let any little seedlings that you see, you know, grow to adulthood and make seeds. So that's a fairly easy one to deal with. The greenbrier, very prickly, and if you've ever tried to pull it, you can't pull it. It has underground stems, and then it also has these very gnarly white underground like storage structures. So that's one you're either going to have to dig and make sure you get those underground storage structures, or it'll just resprout. Or it's one that you can use a dip and clip method on. And especially because greenbrier likes to grow up into shrubbery and other plants, oftentimes you can't get in there to spray or even to try to pull or to dig without disturbing the desirable plants. So, you know, take your clipper, get a broadleaf herbicide that's translocated, and the most common active ingredients would be glyphosate, which is what is in Roundup and many other types of broad spectrum post-emergent killer herbicides, or 2,4-D is good on broadleaves. So and through extension, you know, we always recommend the active ingredient. We don't recommend brand or trade names of products. So you give them the active ingredient, then they can go find it wherever they purchase their products. But those are the chemicals that deal with broadleaves, and it has to be a very strategic, focused approach to dealing with greenbrier. And you need long sleeves and eye protection from the stickers, because those things will definitely come back and hit you in the face and scratch up your arms really bad.
Thank you so much. That was the last of our questions. So wonderful timing. Thank you to everyone who joined us this afternoon, and to you, Laurie, for coming back again. You joined us both in March and May as an EMG webinar speaker. So we really appreciate your time and knowledge.
My pleasure.
And hopefully we'll have you back again.
All right. Thanks, happy everybody. Spring and happy gardening, everybody.
I'm putting the webinar archive.
You're on mute.
Oh, yep. There we go. Putting the webinar link in the chat box again for anybody who needs it. Thanks, everyone.